And I would like to continue studying the Bur Oak tree. I mentioned Bur Oak when doing my series on the white oak a few weeks ago. And I was in the same location comparing the leaves of those two trees. And I'm back here. This is a high water channel of the Little Miami River here in Warren County, Ohio. There's no water coming through it right now, just some puddles. But often this does flow, just not this time of year. We've had a very dry late summer and early fall here in southwest Ohio. But we have a Bur Oak tree overhanging the banks here. It's getting undercut, and eventually this will fall in the river. I do often find them along this river and the other rivers in this part of the Mid-Ohio Valley. And the Bur Oak is also a tree that can be found in the eastern Great Plains and the cold prairies of Minnesota and North Dakota and even up into Manitoba. We can look at the acorns on these trees in a few minutes and see why the acorn might help us remember the name Bur Oak, because it lives where it gets very cold. But these leaves have a similar shape to the white oak. Let's take one and compare it directly to a white oak tree. And on the left is my Bur Oak leaf. It's a darker color than this white oak. It has a fringed or almost a wavy top with some obvious rounded lobes towards the base, and it is almost always wider at the top than at the base. This white oak can have almost a similar appearance at the top because the insects ate away at this lobe, but the lobes are often more rounded and consistently rounded, and the notches, which are also rounded, are usually about the same depth into the leaf. We can always find exceptions, but on the right is our white oak, and you can tell there's a slight difference in the geometry. Got several white oaks here I picked while hiking a few days ago. Here's one here. Again, these notches on this white oak come about the same depth into the leaf, and on this Bur Oak they do not. Some come almost to the mid-vein and some don't. And there's a lot of variability in Bur Oak leaves. So I'm going to add some more footage to this video in a few minutes. Up the river here a few miles, there's some really good example of Bur Oak acorns that are still on the branches, and some Bur Oak leaves that are getting full sun and are quite large. And let's continue our study of the Bur Oak tree. You know, I'm a hiker, but I'm also a cyclist, and there's extensive bike trail networks in southwest Ohio. And riding along the other day, I started hitting these bumps in the trail, and sure enough, they were Bur Oak acorns. And this is just a few miles upstream from that last specimen we looked at. And these trees get more sun, they overhang the trail, so the acorns are a little easier to find, and they're closer to the ground. And the Latin name for the Bur Oak is Quercus macrocarpa, which is Latin for an oak tree with big acorns. And look at the size of this acorn. I've got one on the ground. We can put something next to it for scale in just a minute here, but they're at least 1.5 inches long. And one way we can remember Bur Oak is it grows very far north, up actually into southern Canada, in the area around Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Saskatoon, and extremely cold climates where it can get well below zero for many weeks at a time. And it can grow there in the eastern Great Plains and the cold prairies of North Dakota. So let's say that if the Bur Oak is going to live where it's that cold, it needs a nice warm fur coat around its acorn, and that's what this looks like. I don't know if that's the reason, but that's one way we can remember, is Bur Oak grows farther north than the other oaks and has this nice warm fuzzy coat around its acorn that can help it stay warm, if that were the reason it has that. And here's our leaf again with those lobes. Some are rounded and some are less deep into the mid-vein than the others, but there's a lot of variability, and it could be confused with the white oak, so you got to be looking for acorns and the bark as well. We'll get on with the bark in a few days here. I've got another specimen a few miles from here that has really good bark for studying, and we'll get back to that shortly. But let's pause for just a moment and look at these acorns. And continuing on with their study of the Bur Oak acorns, the ones on the tree still had a greenish hue. When they fall to the ground, they turn to brown like most acorns. But here's our acorns on the right from a Bur Oak tree. We got a U.S. currency quarter there for scale. So they're at least as big as that quarter, and usually bigger, 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches long. Sometimes the cap comes all the way over the acorn, like the one in the top left here, and sometimes it only comes halfway down, but it always has that fuzzy appearance, like it was knitted with yarn that was real fuzzy and knitted almost all the way over the acorn to keep it warm in those cold climates. So this is a plant that often grows west of the Appalachians and in the prairies, and the maps show it actually down into Texas. And its range can overlap with that of the white oak. It can often be found in areas near where the swamp white oak grows. I've done a series on that in the past. Got videos on that on this channel. Swamp white oak acorns are much smaller. You can see they're on the left here. They do have a cap that comes partway down over the nut and sometimes all the way over the nut, but they're much smaller. And the only other tree you can confuse these acorns with would be the overcup oak, which is a Mississippi Valley below St. Louis type of tree. Comes into the western Ohio near Evansville, according to the range maps. I've never found it, but I might try to add that to this channel in the future, and we could bring some Bur Oak acorns with us. But they do have a acorn cap that covers the entire nut, but the nut is usually much smaller than that of the Bur Oak. So we're going to continue on with our study of the Bur Oak tree. In a few days here, I've got some trees along the Great Miami River that have real good bark for teaching. These ones here have a lot of underbrush and poison ivy growing on them that would make it hard to look at the bark. So we'll continue on shortly. And we've come about 30 miles further north from the specimen along the Little Miami Bike Trail with all those well-knit acorn caps and acorns. And here we've got a tree that's dropped the acorns, and the squirrel has already got the nut, but the cap is left. And there's our leaf. Again, a lot of variability in these Bur Oak leaves. But in general, it is wider at the top than at the base, and not all the lobes are the same depth, or the notches are the same depth. We've got some good-looking trees here, not obscured by poison ivy or honeysuckle. Let's take a look at the bark on this Bur Oak. It's very evenly furrowed with lots of ridges and furrows the whole way up the tree. This is about a 1.5 foot diameter tree, maybe 60, 70 years old, and it's got those furrows and ridges even on the smaller branches. So it's a consistently furrowed tree, much darker than the white oak or the chinkapin oak in the color of the bark. I've got my white oak bark from a few weeks ago, which at Sherwin-Williams was HGSW 1497. You can see that's much lighter than the shade of this Bur Oak tree. I've got that is 2 shades darker, HGSW 1495. So again, these paint strips are readily available at hardware stores, paint stores. I got these at Lowe's instead of Sherwin-Williams, but you can get them at Sherwin-Williams too. It's their color scheme that I'm using on these oak trees, and probably some other trees as well. These furrows can get quite deep. This tree is maybe 1.5 inches deep. On the furrows, this larger tree down here has furrows double that size. Got a little bit of euonymus growing up this guy here. Let's get around to this side, and there's some much deeper furrows here, maybe 2 inches deep. And again, they go the whole way up the tree. I mean, this almost looks like a tulip poplar, but the furrows are rougher, and they don't make the nice diamond shapes that you find on a tulip poplar. It could be confused with a cottonwood, except obviously the leaves are much different. In the cottonwood, as you look up the tree, the bark gets smoother, and sometimes it's very smooth at the top, and the Bur Oak is never smooth, even on the smallest branches. So this is the study of our Bur Oak. This is along the Great Miami River here in Montgomery County, Ohio. And this is where I often find it, in these floodplains. In this part of the country, if you get into open farmland and areas that used to be prairie, you can find it along fence rows and even in some abandoned fields as a pioneer species. And in the Great Prairies, Great Plains, and the cold prairies of the Dakotas, the eastern half of the Dakotas, it's found in a lot of locations where other trees won't grow because of the climate. Here's another one right here. So this is our Bur Oak with its bark and the we'll put the wraps on our study of the Bur Oak. This is not a common tree on every trail, but I find it on a regular basis. Sometimes only a few trees, sometimes there's dozens of them.